So when I was asked to do this, I wasn't entirely sure what was I going to say. That, I'm not a career scientist, a student. And what could I actually tell you as my colleagues, as my fellow students? So what I decided to do is turn it on its head. Really talk about how I envision wherever science is going and how we can influence that, how we can impact the 21st century as future scientists, whether you're going into medicine or plant biology, or you're going into conservation biology or marine biology, or you're going to any other of the sciences, which of course are cropping up all the time. New ones using new technology, new ideas. So that's really what I want to do. And when I was trying to think about what topic, I really couldn't decide on one specific thing. Because as Craig Venter said when he was here, he was part of the UB Distinguished Speakers series. And he was talking and he said, biology is to the 21st century what physics was to the 20th, what chemistry was to the 19th. And that is, it is this wide, expansive, complicated network, which is very cool. It's going to allow us to solve all kinds of problems. But that also makes it difficult picking one topic. So I decided to break out into 4 issues, 4 things I think we should keep in mind as we look forward. And they're really divided up in 2 areas. One is what I call civilization goals. And then I'll get to the other one, which is more about what we can do as scientists to cope with this complex world. And so civilization goals, the whole idea of how you influence public policy, how you go out there and make science available to all. You would write your papers, you would be as part of the actual scientific community, but then maybe you would write in a popular science magazine. Maybe you would testify before a committee. It was like a major career-changing event, maybe even Congress. But that was it. You would influence science, you wouldn't direct it. Well, of course, as you deal with all of these complex issues, how do we actually go out there and direct it? We know that science can solve a lot of these problems. How do we actually do it? And so, back in 2010, when the British election was going on, all eyes were on Gordon Brown and David Cameron. That was what everyone was looking at. But in a small, it was the Bosworth parliamentary constituency. It was in central England. And you had the major players running, the Labour Party, the Tories, the Liberal Democrats, fine. But there was something else. There was a science party. And it wasn't a third party, like the I like my lawn mowed a little bit better than yours. But it was all about science for the public. It wasn't just for scientists, it was for everyone. It only garnered 197 votes. Its leader was Dr. Michael Brooks, who had a PhD in quantum physics. And everyone went, well, okay, he only has 197 votes. Is it a failure? Well, not entirely, because it had never been done before. They had never thought about having a political party for science for society. They'd always thought about it as science for scientists or science for teachers. Probably 197 votes they got with probably all the science teachers in town and their families. But that was also the other point. It was also a failure in that they only garnered 197 votes. And then comes the question, why? Why did people not see science as something that could aid them, that could expand the economy? Brooks went around, he did all the same things that politicians do. He went around, to factories for solar panels, and he went and he saw, new agricultural methods, but yet that didn't work. Why? And I looked at it and I said, well, perhaps it's because the public still saw the science party as just that, a party for scientists, not a party for the public. So that gets me into the second topic. Because if you want to be politically active, if we want to be politically active, if we want to direct policy rather than just influence it, the public has to know that science is worth something. The public has to know that science is, you can actually do something with it. So we have a lot of shows that have been on, since the 90s. Great shows, The Magic School Bus, Bill Nye, Nova. And each one of them, did they dumb things down? Not entirely. I mean, they even talked about lactic acid on the Magic School Bus. But what they did do is they got very direct. They helped to simplify things. They got really direct, and they were able to teach things that otherwise everyone says, well, the public couldn't understand. Unless you're a scientist, you can't possibly understand why this is important. So then I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, if that's the case, then maybe there's something that we can actually do. Maybe there's something that we can do to educate the public better. So I have 3 stories about this. The first one, if you remember, a couple years ago, ClimateGate. There was this whole idea that these emails were hacked and that maybe climate change wasn't real, the Anthropocene climate change, that's false, and everything else. And the pundits, of course, came back and always said, well, that makes sense because, this is fraud because there was a cold winter. It couldn't possibly be part of a long-term trend. Well, I'm also a student in the history department, and some history students were asking me those very questions. They said, well, I don't understand this. So I looked at it and I said, well, think about this. We all know about Indian summer. It's October. It's 75 degrees outside. Now, do you honestly believe that winter's now coming? You may want to not believe it for a while, but you know that winter's coming. You know that temperatures are going to fall. So, okay, if there's a hiccup, if you have if you have a cold winter or a chilly summer, that doesn't necessarily mean that the trend isn't real. And they got it. They're not in science, but they got it. Because it didn't matter that they didn't understand all of the statistics behind it, statistical relevancy and p-values and all that. That's not what mattered to them. What mattered to them is that they found a real-world example and connected to it. And that's what, as future scientists, as future physicians, as future teachers, we have to do. We have to educate the public in that way and use examples that they understand. Another example, this is a great example of this. The military had this whole idea of how they were going to explain the Afghanistan war. And this is what they did. And if you can understand that, they're looking for you. So the problem with this is that's how a lot of scientists were explaining to the public. They knew everything, they knew all of the data, but they would explain it as by saying, well, we have this data, we have to throw out this, and we have this p-value and this, and then they would throw up another slide that would look like something like this, and the public is just lost and they're, well, I'm going home now. You can't do that. Now, this is very important when you're in a scientific conference, but it's not important when you're talking to the public. So the other story comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Many of you know him from NOVA, astrophysicist, director of the Hayden Planetarium. And he was at UB as another UB Distinguished Speakers in April of 2010. I went to see him. It was very interesting. He writes a lot of books, not just for scientists, but for the public. And he writes them with great titles like Death by Black Hole. You can see that the words are kind of sinking in. I mean, you're walking along in the aisle and you're seeing all these really old books and you see these newer books. They have really, cryptic titles like, TNF alpha and this and that. And then you see this. Everyone's going to pick it up. Scientists are going to pick it up. People in the public are going to pick it up. And he writes directly. When he was at UB, he was asked by somebody, well, why do we care about space? Why do we care about that? There's so many problems here on Earth. So he could have given this really, esoteric answer about a Star Trek future we're all living on the Andromeda Galaxy. But he didn't. He said, well, there's this asteroid called Apophis, so named for the Egyptian deity of destruction and chaos. And see, if it goes around this particular pinhole and this particular keyhole in 2029, well, it's going to hit us in 2036. Everybody got it. Everybody knew what that meant. Everybody knew that that could rain a lot of destruction. You didn't have to have the entire Greek alphabet to do it. And everybody understood it. So as we look forward to a career in science, we need to think about those kinds of things. How are we going to move on? The final story comes from when I was doing a second visit to Baylor's MD PhD. And they have a group called BRASS. Basically it's a group of Houston wealthy individuals who contribute so that students can be educated in science. They got funding for it. Well, the story of how it goes, I should preface this by saying we don't know any names, they were never told to us. But the story of how it goes was there was a Baylor scientist who was being paid by the NIH. She was going to Congress to testify before it. She was put in the first-class cabin. She was sitting next to one of Houston's biggest socialites. So they struck up a conversation. Of course, she didn't get into all the details of every single experiment, but she got it very plain and simple of what she did. And the woman asked, well, what is the biggest problem for you? She said, well, funding a student.